I'm performing a bunch of works today by composers who were women who lived in the United States. Some of them are still living. Others would date back into the 19th century. And I'm going to talk about each of them, announce the pieces, and talk a little bit about the composers, and also about some of the issues that came up as I was studying them. I took this project on because I was thinking about how, as a musicologist, I work on gender, but as a performer, there's really very little representation of women composers in my repertoire. And so I proposed a sabbatical project to my university, and that's what I've been up to. I've been spending the year learning works, and I've learned many more than the 9 that I'm playing today, but this is just a sort of a small sampling. The first piece that I'm going to play is a work by a composer whose career began not in the United States, but in Venezuela, Teresa Carreño. And she emigrated from Venezuela with her family. She was born in the 1850s. She emigrated with her family when she was about 8 or 9 years old because she was a child prodigy at the piano. And her parents wanted her to have more opportunities as a performer. And so they moved to New York City, and she started performing concerts up and down the East Coast, and then traveled to Europe and performed in France and other parts of Western and Central Europe. And very interestingly, she had kind of a second career. While she was in France, she studied voice with Rossini and ended up having a second career as an opera singer as well. She was absolutely the consummate professional. She was on stage for the whole of her life, either as a pianist or as a singer. But that's the rarity for women of her time. So the work I'm going to play is from 1872. It's called Berceuse, meaning lullaby. In that day and age, in the 1870s, the vast majority of pianists in the United States were women, but they weren't professionals, they were amateurs. And even though Carreño herself was on the stage, I think that the piece I'm playing, this Berceuse, really reflects the style that was typically used for female piano students and women playing in the domestic setting. You'll hear it's very lyrical, it's kind of understated, very lyrical and pleasant, and made just to be sort of enjoyable, simple music for the domestic setting. composer of the second piece I'm going to play, Amy Beach, was also a child prodigy like Carreño. She grew up in a well-off northeastern family and performed often on the stage, especially in her teenage years. Her family was really supportive, she concertized quite a bit, but she got married when she was 18, and at that point, she and her parents and her soon-to-be husband kind of came up with an agreement about what would be appropriate for her career. He was also a member of high society, and what they decided was that she should be allowed to perform one concert a year. So that is, in some ways, that's part of why we have so much of her compositions from that moment. She really could pour herself into composing. She also, it was part of the agreement that she wouldn't spend any time teaching out of the home. That was seen as something that women did who needed to earn money for their families, so not appropriate for her social class either. So she really was devoting herself for quite some time to composing only. She concertized more after her husband died. He was much older, and so she sort of had a second stage of her career later on. The piece that I'm going to play by her is one of her 4 sketches from 1892. It's a piece called Dreaming. This is a bit similar to the Carreño in the sense that it reflects the type of salon music that was really common in the late 19th century and was often performed by women. But Beach was a real virtuosa, and I think you can tell, especially for the pianist in the room, what kind of skill level she had in this piece. So even though it's quite slow and lyrical, you'll notice that there's always this murmuring going on. In my left hand, I'm murmuring. In the lower fingers of my right hand, I'm murmuring. And then the melody sort of floats up above all the murmuring. And I always say to my students, the hardest thing you can do on the piano is have to play pretty quick moving notes very, very quietly. And that's really what this piece is all about. So again, this is from 1892. It's called Dreaming. those two pieces, the next work that's coming will feel like a world apart. This is a piece by the composer Ruth Crawford. She grew up, she was born in 1901, I think, grew up a little bit apart from the concert music establishment, and that fed her interest in really studying what was cutting edge music of the time. So the work I'm playing is from 1924, and when she wrote this, she was just absolutely at the forefront of the kind of ultra-modernist movement of the time. She knew the music of the Second Viennese School, composers like Schoenberg and Webern, and she was interested in extreme dissonance, in writing in a fully atonal musical language at a time when many composers weren't doing it yet. They weren't trying that. What's interesting with Crawford is that we often think of her for the sort of second part of her life and her career. She got married in the early 1930s to the ethnomusicologist Charles Seeger, and the two of them took a real interest in the preservation and dissemination of American folk music. They worked for the federal government. This is during the years of the Great Depression, so they saw folk music as being a voice for the common person in American society, and they wanted to really take care, to preserve and to popularize folk music from the United States. Their son, so his son and Ruth Crawford's stepson was Pete Seeger, one of the most famous folk musicians of the 20th century. So we often think of her as being known for that, which makes a lot of sense for her politics. She was very much a left-wing person, and during the years of the Great Depression, of course, it makes sense that she and her husband were devoting themselves to music that would speak for regular people, many of whom were so marginalized at the time. But the early years of her career, she was in another musical language entirely, and that's what this piece represents. So I'm playing one of her preludes here from 1924. It's a very short piece, and it has basically a shape of two crescendos. So it starts quite quietly with a motive, a dissonant motive that repeats up at the top of the piano. And then you'll hear this sort of tenor melody come in, and it builds. And then after you get to a climactic moment, it stops, starts again, builds a second time, and then there's sort of a coda that brings everything down at the end. So Ruth Crawford's sixth prelude from 1924. composers represented on the program are teacher and student. So the next work is a piece by Florence Price, and then the piece that will follow it is a work by Margaret Bonds, who studied with Price when she was a teenager. Price is probably the most famous composer I'm playing today, but that wouldn't have been the case, say, about 15 years ago. And so though many of you may know this story, I'm going to share it. And with my journey into this piece by Price, and I've also learned her piano sonata, I've really given some thought to ways in which the field that I'm in, which is musicology, but a women's-centered musicology, a feminist musicology, ways in which it's changed in the last several years. So kind of a digression, and then I'll get into some thoughts about that. So the Price grew up in the early 20th century. She was a Black composer in an upper middle class family in Arkansas. Her parents were profoundly supportive of her work as a pianist, which was her main instrument, and as a composer. She went off to study at New England Conservatory. Her mom urged her to disguise her racial identity. So you can see even when she graduated, she's listed as being from Mexico. She wasn't Latina at all, but her mother was concerned about discrimination because they were African American. And Price then launched into a huge career as a composer. She wrote over 300 pieces, and there were always performers out there. There were always people who were playing her music, and I'll come back to that point soon. But what happened about 15 years ago, 2009, is that a bunch of works of Price were discovered in a summer house that she had in Illinois. And some very notable performers and some scholars took notice and started performing her works. And so suddenly there were 2 violin concerti. Her 4 symphonies were just recorded actually by my hometown orchestra, Philadelphia Orchestra. And at this point in time right now, not just on American concert series, but I would say in Europe as well, Price looms large. She's featured very much in our sort of present concert music landscape. The reason I mentioned that she wasn't totally forgotten is that there really were always people who followed her and who knew her music and cared about it. And so in some ways, I think that the real recent renaissance of interest in her work is more of a change in the landscape of scholarship and programming in our country than it is anything else. If you think back to some of the earliest efforts in a kind of women-centered musicology, so musicology from, say, the 1980s and 90s, there was a real focus on female composers, but often white female composers or Germanic female composers. And it's taken longer for that circle to expand to include someone like Florence Price. It's very similar to the ways that we talk about second wave feminism at the same time, and how that movement was more centered on white, middle-class, educated women than it was on anybody who didn't quite fit into that categorization. So I think we see something similar with Price. And what, of course, is very, very interesting about this, and it's a famous quote of Price, is that she spoke about that in her own time. So there's a quote of hers where she wrote a letter to the famous composer Sergei Kusevitsky, and she said, she was trying to get him to take an interest in her music. And she said, you know, I have 2 disadvantages. I am a woman and I'm also Black. And that means that I struggle to be recognized. And she said in her letter, set those things aside and just judge my music for its contents alone. There's no indication that Kusevitsky ever responded to her. But when we think about that statement, it's a great example of her articulating intersectionality, which is really now the focus of feminism in our culture. And her talking about the very idea in the letters from the 1940s and saying that I am subject to 2 forms of disadvantage, 2 forms of oppression because of both the color of my skin and because I'm a woman. Now, all of this is to say that when you look at her music and you think of how much she struggled for recognition because she was a woman of color, she makes her Blackness really central to her music. The piece that I'm going to play is called her Fantasy Negra, number 2. She wrote 4 of these. This piece is from 1929, so 5 years after the Crawford that we just heard. And in this work, Price has composed 2 tunes that she sort of weaves through the whole piece. And those tunes are very much in the style of Black spirituals. and laments. You can hear one of the songs, the tunes that she's written, bears some resemblance to the song Motherless Child. If you know that song, you may recognize the influence there. She's also, this is 1929, she knows the harmonic language of blues and popular music, jazz of her time, and you can hear the influence of those things in the way that she set these melodies throughout the piece. Meanwhile, it's also kind of a virtuoso tour de force, so it starts pretty innocuously, but it grows into a big old Lisztian virtuoso work. So here we go. Fantasy Negra number 2. This is from 1929. piece that follows this one is by Margaret Bonds, who, as I mentioned, studied with Florence Price. She was also an African-American composer who, a bit younger than Price, she grew up and ended up her career really coinciding with the civil rights movement. The work I'm writing, that I'm performing, by her, is a piece that she wrote in 1967, so absolutely at the height of that movement. Bonds went to Northwestern and then on to Juilliard to study composition, and she always maintained a real interest in drawing on African-American folk music. So unlike the Price that I just played, in the piece I'm about to perform by Margaret Bonds, she's taken a famous melody, the song Wade in the Water, and she's set that piece and arranged it through this work. So you'll recognize the tune, most likely. This piece is called Troubled Water. So she's playing with that title, it's Wade in the Water, and she's written what's sort of similar to the Price in that it's like a big virtuoso work. She's written this big piece where that tune is the center of it, and it's set throughout the piece. I think that the time in which this was written, 1967, so thinking of this as just before Martin Luther King was shot, and just at the height of the fight for Black rights in the 1960s, I don't think that's an accident. I think that it's very, very much intentional, and that the work's title, Troubled Water, reflects what was going on at the time. So Troubled Water from 1967 by Margaret Bonds. When I was thinking about what pieces to study this year, I really wanted to include a work by a Native American composer, and someone I grew up with recommended J.J. Hollingsworth to me. So she's the composer of the next piece. She's a composer in San Francisco. A lot of her music is performed in the Bay Area primarily, but she's a Native woman who grew up in eastern Colorado. And a lot of the music that she writes really reflects her interest and memories of the landscape of her childhood. That's a big part of a lot of music from the United States, a reflection of the distinctness and diversity of the landscape in this country. So in her pieces, Hollingsworth also often tries to evoke the landscape that she grew up with. And the piece of music I'm featuring here is it's a suite she composed for the piano called Under the Blue Dome from 1984. And there's 6 movements in this piece. I'm gonna play 2 of them. The first of those movements is called Granddaddy Longlegs, and you will hear that it is evoking a daddy longlegs, and he is walking. You can hear his sort of awkward ambulation throughout the piece of music. In the program notes, Hollingsworth talks about how, as a child, she would go outside into the kind of prairie with her siblings, and they would get a daddy longlegs on a stick and just enjoy watching his funny little walk along the stick, and then they'd flip it over and he'd walk back and they'd do it again. And that was one way that they played. And then the second piece that I'm performing from the suite is called The Mourning Dove. And this work is really about nostalgia. So it's not just about the landscape, but it's about her feelings of longing for the landscape of her childhood. You will hear the dove singing a little bit in the piece, and overall just get a feeling for a kind of misty nostalgia throughout. So Under the Blue Dome from 1984 by J.J. Hollingsworth. composer of the next work is Joan Tower, who is a giant in the landscape of music making in this country. She is in her 80s, well into her 80s now, and I mention that because she's someone who's been fighting basically for years for equal recognition for her work as a composer as the recognition received by men. And she's achieved it. She's won just about every award out there. She founded many, many years ago a new music group called Da Capo Players that is still thriving in New York City. She's successful in the academia. She's a professor at Bard College. She often in her music has made her gender and identity central to her work. So, for instance, she has a piece of music called Fanfare for the Uncommon Woman as a response to Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. It's much bigger than Copland's piece, much more discursive as well. So again, I think of Tower as someone who has kind of fought tooth and nail through her career and has achieved what she set out to get, and she still looms very large. She's still writing music, I should say, as well, and she shows up to Da Capo concerts all the time. It's just pretty amazing. So the piece of hers I'm going to play is a great example of the kind of musical language she typically writes in. Early in her career, she was drawn particularly to the work of the serialist composers like Schoenberg, whom I mentioned earlier. And she would write pieces using serialist techniques, 12-tone techniques. She branched out from that quite a bit over the years, but in general, her pieces are always fully embracing a kind of dissonant, atonal musical language, and often they're pieces that pose a challenge to the listener, works in which she wants to kind of push you out of your comfort zone. The piece I'm playing is from 1996. It's called Holding a Daisy. And this work is one gigantic build-up. So you'll hear in this piece that it starts very slowly, very still, and gradually it grows and grows, and then when it bursts out of its shell, it's enormous. Earlier today we had to see if there's any feedback from the mic, and so they asked me to play the loudest moment in the program, and that's from this piece, no question. So there's a gigantic climactic moment, and then the piece will sort of die down, but quite quickly it just sort of scurries away and disappears. You'll notice also there's a rhythmic mode of tying the work together, so you can often hear throughout the piece this rhythm that comes again and again, short, long, short, long, short, long, and your ear may gravitate to that as you listen as well. 1996, Holding a Daisy, Joan Tower. play two more pieces this afternoon. The next work is a piece by the composer Alex Temple, who's a professor at Arizona State University. They're younger than I am. Temple's about 40, I guess, at this point. And I didn't know their music, but they were recommended to me as someone whose works I should get to know. Temple is trans and genderqueer, and I wasn't actually sure that they'd want to be on this program. I'm devoting myself to music written by women composers, and I wasn't sure if that was something that they'd want to be included in, so I just reached out and asked. And when they gave me the 2 thumbs up, I got to know this piece of music. Temple's very vocal in their career about how their music reflects their identity and their experiences as a genderqueer person. This work that I'm playing is from 2019, and then they revised it a number of years later. From 1999, and then revised in 2019. That's what I meant to say. And so they wrote it originally when they were very, very young. And it's not explicitly about anything. The title's not particularly evocative. It doesn't draw on identity politics at all. But when you think of the fact that Temple's so vocal about the ways in which their music reflects their experience, I think it's pretty smart to look at the shape of this work and the kind of story that this piece tells and think about how that might fit in with the kinds of things that they talked about elsewhere. This is a very unusual shape for a piece. There are 14 movements here, but it's only about 4 minutes long because each movement is less than 20 seconds. The thing that's really unusual here is not even that the pieces are so short or really kind of fragments, which is how I would describe them, but rather that they're not building towards anything in particular. There's not a single linear narrative, but it's much more kind of a mix of emotions, one that follows another, and then something unexpected that comes after that. So when you listen to it, I think sort of knowing that it's going to stand outside of that traditional narrative that builds to something really big, I think is an important way to sort of think about this musical experience. Again, just like with the prize, reflecting on musicology this year as I got to know this piece, thinking about Temple's work and including it here and knowing that they approved of my including it here reminded me of another way in which my field has changed and in which feminist musicology has gotten away from a kind of gender binarism to something very, very different and more inclusive.
The piece is called Microphages. I forgot to say that. Microphages, 1999/2019, Alex Temple.
Before I play the last piece, I'd just like to thank you all again for being here and tell you I'm performing a lot of these works again and again. I play them again tomorrow. At the end of the month, I'm performing them in Philadelphia along with a piece I commissioned as part of this project. So I commissioned a work from the Philadelphia composer Suzanne Sorkin, and I'll give the world premiere of it at a concert in Philadelphia at the end of March. But I'm thinking in that concert of organizing the pieces differently and not playing them chronologically, and I'm always up for changing the types of things I'm talking about. I do change them every time I perform this program, but I'm very happy to chat with you and get your feedback and your thoughts and ideas, knowing who you liked, what pieces you liked, who you wanted to learn more about, anything you didn't like, just bring it. So after I finish, I'd be very, very happy to chat, and I'll come right back. So please stick around if you'd like to talk. The final work is called The Currents. It's by Sarah Kirkland Snyder, who's a really well-established composer. She wrote this in 2012. I would describe her style as being the sort of New Amsterdam style of music. So New Amsterdam Records tends to produce records of a certain type of composer, and she's one of them. And in that style, I would say that it's very much influenced by minimalism. So she's writing in a style in which you can hear a kind of gradual unfolding and repetition throughout the piece of music. The title reflects that. It's the currents, and you hear this sort of general flowing and ebbing throughout the work. Different currents, one and then another, but very much that sense of kind of tides throughout. And the second influence I often mention with my students with the New Amsterdam style is the influence of popular music and popular music harmony. I think that's less prevalent here, although on the heels of a piece like The Tower that we heard just a few minutes ago, this will seem profoundly consonant after that work. So this is The Currents. It's from 2012 by Sarah Kirkland Snyder.